Hello everybody and welcome to our virtual 67 Pall Mall. Later on today we'll be joined by the MD of AXA Millesines, Mr. Christian Seeley, for a tasting of Chateau Pichon Longueville Baron. And then finally for today, Tal Cohen will be tasting wines from the Judean Hills. For now, we're very happy to welcome back Richard Bamfield, MW, who'll be joined by Nick Baker of The Finest Bubble, and they'll be tasting English sparkling wines alongside champagnes. So please chat away on the side, share with us what you're drinking, where you're drinking it from, and share on social media with hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end where you can ask both the gentlemen questions. So a big hello to Richard and to Nick. Hey, how are you guys?
Very good, thank you, Ronan. Good to be here. Nice to see you, Nick.
Very
Nice
well.
to see you both.
And well done, Nick, for your table decorations, the flags. That's excellent. I really like that. Okay.
Right, thanks, guys.
The only difference between our pictures is that your glasses are empty and mine do actually have something in already. But I figured I'd better get a head start and just check that how they're all tasting. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our tasting this afternoon. I must say, when we thought about this and the date, we didn't realise that it was the opening day of English Wine Week, but that is fairly fortuitous, as we do have an English sparkling wine supported by a brace of excellent champagnes. More of that in a minute or so. Just to indicate, we've got 3 champagnes to taste. And what I'm really going to be looking at here is there are various questions I hope we can answer with the 3 that we've got in front of us. Can we tell the difference between a Blanc de Blanc and a Blanc de Noir, a wine made from white grapes and a wine made from black grapes? Secondly, does rosé champagne genuinely taste different to white, or are we drinking with our eyes? Not always clear, I think. And finally, and probably the biggest question, and maybe the hardest to answer, how do English sparkling wine and champagne really differ? And I'm thinking more about the contents of the glass here. I should add at this stage, if you're joining us this afternoon to learn about the nuclearization points in the glass and the pros and cons of jetting or malolactic fermentation, you may be in the wrong place. I'm going to concentrate very much on the contents of the glass and what we can learn from them rather than the technicalities. But if what we're tasting does trigger questions about those items above, then happy to talk about them. Without further ado, I'd really quite like to get stuck in, and forgive me if I'm leading you into bad habits by encouraging you to start drinking at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I apologize, although funny enough, I don't sense too much resistance on the other side of my camera this afternoon. Right, let's see what we've got here. So we're kicking off with, I thought we'd start with the Blanc de Blanc, because a Blanc de Blanc typically will be the lightest of these. Sorry, I should say, Nick, did you want to say anything before we actually embark on the wines themselves?
No, the only thing I would say is if anybody's watching and hasn't opened their sparkling wine or champagne, I'd encourage you to get them open. Yes. I normally would have had them open at least an hour before I do this. Today I've been running a bit behind, so I'm just opening mine now, but give them plenty of time.
Absolutely. Okay, excellent. Now, we're kicking off, as I say, with a Blanc de Blanc. So made, because Chardonnay is the main white grape in Champagne, made entirely from Chardonnay. The best area in Chardonnay typically is the Côte de Blanc, just to the south of Épernay. And Pierre Gimounet are one of the best known producers and one of the biggest vineyard owners in the Côte de Blanc. And they own, I think it's 24 or 28 hectares of vineyards, that's a lot for a grower in Champagne, of which 74% is Grand Cru and 26% is Premier Cru. And they really do have some pedigree. The Gimonets, their family dates back to 1750 in the Champagne area. And the estate in its current form goes back to earlier in the 20th century. And in fact, it's Pierre Gimonet's grandsons, Olivier and Didier, who look after it now. Those 28 hectares are spread over 40 separate parcels of vines, as is typical in Champagne. I'm sure we'll come back to that in the course of the next hour or so. And because Champagne is quite fragmented, and Champagne is typically a blended wine. And so having those separate parcels is critical to giving them the raw materials, the diversity of styles that they can blend to produce the style that they're after. And unlike some in Champagne, how can I put this? Champagne is not ashamed of yields which would be considered on the high side in many parts of Europe, but it's quite possible to make outstanding Champagne from relatively high yields, and therefore the vines are often replaced relatively soon, often at 30 to 35 years. The Gimonets actually believe in older vines, and some of their own vines are over 100 years old, and I think the average is over 40, which is probably older than average in Champagne. Can one taste the difference? Well, maybe we'll come on to that later. Now, I did say I was going to concentrate on what we've got in the glass. Just one thing, if you have got the wines in front of you and you have already poured them, it is well worth just having a look at the difference in colour between the Blanc de Blanc and the Blanc de Noir that is coming next. Because I think that is, we're often asked, what are the differences between the two? One of the ways one can often tell the difference between a Blanc de Blanc and a Blanc de Noir is partly through colour. A Blanc de Blanc, particularly when it's young, and a wine like this at 6 years old, that would still be regarded relatively young for a Blanc de Blanc. They are typically pretty pale in colour. Chardonnay, especially when it's not too ripe, doesn't give wines with a great deal of colour. Whereas the Blanc de Noir, you will see, is deeper. And very often with a Blanc de Noir, you might see just a little bit of pink to the colour as well. And that's true of much white Champagne, which is made with a higher percentage of Meunier and Pinot Noir. You might see that blush edge to the colour. One of the intriguing characteristics of this particular wine, the Gastronome 2014, is that it's bottled with lower pressure. This has about 4.5 atmospheres of pressure as compared to the usual 5.5, 6. And yet certainly in my glass, there's no shortage of bubbles. One wouldn't be able to tell from looking at it that it was that there was any shortage of gas or lower gas than in other champagnes. Onto the nose. When young, a Blanc de Blanc will typically smell of very gently of white flowers, not the sort of really aromatic scented white flowers like elderflower, like Sauvignon Blanc. But something much more delicate, more subtle. But there's also hints of something else, maybe acacia, something like that. And for me, the fruit character, sometimes it can be citrus or green apple. Here, it smells slightly riper than that to me. I find more of a stone fruit character than a green apple, but often it is a green apple character. But above all, very, very, really quite discreet at this stage. One of my favorite Champagne styles is mature Blanc de Blanc. So Blanc de Blanc when it's 10 years plus. And then as it ages, it takes on more of a honeyed character, more of a biscuity character. And to my mind, just a bit more richness on the middle palate while still retaining real delicacy. So that is one of my favorite styles, but having said that, I'm not going to turn my nose up at it when it's young like this either. But aromas that are somehow very composed, assured, without being too ebullient, let's say.
Richard, one of the things you mentioned is you said there was a little bit of riper flavours. And I think that's because the 2014 summer, they have a little bit of warmth. Yeah. And instead of just being appley and lemony, you've got some of those lovely tropical notes in there. It's
a good point. And isn't that just as well? Because for me, that is the point of vintage champagne. If vintage champagne doesn't reflect the vintage it's made from, then what's the point? And it is for me, it's one of the joys of vintage champagne, which is one of the reasons I tend to like champagne from all vintages. I know some people look down their nose at something like 2003 and think, oh, how can you make a vintage champagne in 2003? For me, that's missing the point. The point of making a vintage champagne in 2003 is that you can make a wine that is distinctive because it reflects the vintage. And if it's different in style, well, why not? That's vintage wine for you. So yes, that's a good point about that extra ripeness on the nose. On the palate, really refined, very delicate on the palate. There is, I think, I have to say, if I didn't know that this was lower fizz, I'd like to think I would still have worked it out, because I think the fizz is very gentle. One of the great pleasures of sparkling wine for me, and I've got to be careful not to get too pretentious here, but one of the great pleasures of sparkling wine for me is the way the bubbles can dance on the tongue. And it really is that when you hold the wine in your mouth, there's just this lovely tingling sensation as the bubbles burst on your tongue. I really like that sensation. It's one of the joys of it for me. And it's one of the reasons why, even when now I'm tasting, but even when I'm drinking, I will often I will savor that moment when the bubbles explode on my tongue, because that is part of the pleasure for me. And with this, somehow, there's just a lighter touch to that sort of explosion in the palate. And very, 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 very subtle, beautifully balanced. I think we often associate Blanc de Blanc with higher acidity, greater sharpness. That does not come through in this. Again, I think we're going back to what Nick was saying about the ripeness of the vintage, and probably just maybe, forgive me, I don't know the total acidity of this wine, but I suspect that the acidity may be a little bit lower than is typical for a Blanc de Blanc, and it just comes across a little bit riper, a bit rounder, and there is already a certain smoothness to it, which for a vintage Blanc de Blanc at this age, that's already pretty good. I know I think they see this I mean, there's no question it would work well as an aperitif, but I think the Gimenez see this as a food-friendly type of Blanc de Blanc because it is less gassy, because there's a little bit less fizz. It's just easier to enjoy without food, and I can really see that. It's a hobby horse of mine, but I think champagne is really underrated as a food match. I think it can be a stunning food match. And there are certain foods which I unquestionably prefer champagne with, or good sparkling wine from elsewhere, to other wines. Lobster, for instance. I adore lobster with champagne. For me, it's just, I just enjoy that with more than with any other wine. And but there are other, sort of salmon mousse or something like that I really enjoy with champagne too. So I think, and this, I can see why this would be a lovely food match because of that. It is, for me, it's logical. You can open a bottle, if there's two of you, you can open a bottle like this and have a glass as an aperitif, or even 2 glasses of an aperitif, and still have a glass to go with your starter. What's not to like? For me, that's Nick, of course, would be on to his second bottle by the time he got to the starter. But some of us aren't quite as thirsty as
that. Richard, one of the things that's I really like about this champagne is they managed to capture the minerality, the chalky character.
Yep.
And you mentioned so it's slightly lower pressure. That comes through, I think, with the softer texture in the mouth. But I think the other thing you really get with this Gimenez from 14 is you get this really chalky character. It's almost like a textural thing.
Nick, I'm going to press you on that because I'm fascinated by this whole subject of minerality, and I do find it in wines, but I tend to only use the word in my tastings or in my presentations if I can explain it. And I know what I interpret as minerality in this wine. Could you just explain? You're talking about this chalkiness. Where in your palate are you sensing that?
So for me, my tongue. It's a textural thing. So Lee's aging is very much to me a textural thing I measure, and minerality with often in a lot of the Chardonnays, you get this beautiful it perhaps is a little bit of lees as well, but you get this chalkier texture as well. And in a wine like this, it's probably a combination of the 3 years lees and the minerality that is coming directly from the soils.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that. It is intriguing because my sort of I'm not used to licking chalk, but somehow I can imagine what it would be like. And I do occasionally, if I'm bored and trying to work things out for myself, I will occasionally suck a stone so I can get a feel for what that feels like in my mouth. And there's no question there is a sensation, whether it is textural, it's not flavor, but it is something textural, and there is something there. And I haven't at the moment got a word to describe it other than mineral or stony or possibly chalky. And so I do know what you mean. Sometimes if you lick, again, in the days when we had blotting paper, blotting paper, it had that same sort of feel on the mouth. And I'm just trying to, I think with these things, we use this language, and it's quite useful if we can try to explain what we mean by it. And yet, if I'm tasting a German Riesling, and someone talks about minerality, there I'm in a totally different area. My minerality in German Riesling is not chalkiness, it's not stoniness, it's a totally different area, and yet I would still describe it as mineral. Anyway, that's for another day. But it slips down pretty easily, this, doesn't it? Because it is so gentle, very easy to drink, and yet there's this core, that combination of ripeness and minerality, and that the extra aging all confer on it, help give it that core of flavour.
I think one of the things that's also worth mentioning is I've only had mine open 20 minutes, and from my first experience of it to 15 to 20 minutes later is completely different.
Yeah.
So even in that short time, the aromatics has started to open up, and I'm starting to get some of those cooked apple characters now, which is slowly taking you down that, I don't want to say patisserie shop yet, because it's not, but it's sort of...
Absolutely right. That if you want, that is already indicating the path that it will take as it matures as a Blanc de Blanc champagne. I agree with you, because I actually find that cooked apple or baked apple is very often a characteristic I find on champagne, particularly Blanc de Blanc, as it ages. So yes, I'd agree with you.
And it was only disgorged, Richard, in August, I think. August 19. So everyone should always remember, when a champagne's still on the yeast, on the lees, it's not really aging. So it's protected from the oxygen when it's in the bottle at that point.
Okay.
The minute you pull it off the lees, then you start the slow process of maturation. And this, from only August to now, is a relatively short period of time.
Yeah.
We're only just starting to see some of those secondary bottle maturation characteristics just starting to occur. So from now onwards, we will see the development of this particular champagne.
Well, Nick, I know that you particularly enjoy, and sorry, this is absolutely no use whatsoever for those of you attending this evening, who I assume only have one bottle of this champagne in front of you, unless you're Simon Stockton, of course, in which case you'll have a vertical in front of you probably. But mine was disgorged in December 2017. And so if yours was 2019, it might mean you've got different disgorgements in your stock, and knowing you will probably want to compare the two.
They'll be completely different. Did you say 2017?
17, yeah.
Okay, very, very different.
So there is a difference between the two. But either way, delicious, and I do agree with you that it's expanding as it opens out in the glass and as one works your way through the bottle. As ever, the joy of drinking rather than tasting. It is for me that it is the pleasure of having 2 or 3 glasses from a bottle is just seeing how it changes, how it evolves in the glass.
Richard, in theory, yours should be showing some maturation since it's left the lees now for 3 years. Have you got any more of that, what we call the...
Funny enough, it's coming through much more now than it was when I first tasted it. Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm still not picking up a great deal of patisserie, but I am getting more, somehow there's more. I know that it's ridiculous to think that wine becomes more concentrated as it ages. It's not, it doesn't reduce like a sauce when you're cooking. And yet somehow the flavors can become a bit, I don't know, denser, and that seems to be what's evolving. So I'm finding the flavors more intense now than it was when they were when I first opened it. That could also, it may be just my palate. It could be the wine, but it could be my palate easing its way into the champagne as well. I always think it's probably a combination of the two. The wine opening out and our palate evolving a tiny bit while tasting as well. Okay, right. Now, you better celebrate English Wine Week.
Should I just indulge 1 second?
Yeah.
Before you do that.
Of course.
One of the things, if anybody's got some different glass shapes, I always encourage you to have a little play. I've got the Zalto Burgundy glass here versus the Lehmann Grand Champagne glass. I tend to drink a lot using the Lehmann Grand Champagne just because I think it's a good all-round glass. Now the Zalto Burgundy often works really well with Blanc de Blanc.
Right.
I haven't tried it today. I've just poured some in the glass, but it tends to bring out the spicy, more reductive qualities. So if anybody has to hand a bigger, even a wine glass actually, a glass with that bigger sort of surface area.
Yep.
Now it is bringing out the reductive elements. It's fascinating.
Yes.
So don't be afraid to experiment is always the thing.
I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Okay, English Wine Week. Rathfinny, it was tasting good too?
Actually, that's better in that glass.
All right, okay. All right, well, I'll save a bit in my bottle and I think I've got one of those in the cupboard. So I'll look one of those out later. Thank you. Rathfinny, I am very excited to be tasting this because Rathfinny was founded by Mark and Sarah Driver in 2010. We've been waiting a long time for the first wines to be released, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only person in the wine trade who hasn't yet tasted them. And so this is the first time I have drunk Rathfinny, and I've been really looking forward to it because the reviews of the first releases have been extremely strong, and they're an important estate because they're a big size, and they are already one of the flag wavers for the English sparkling wine business. And they will become even more important in the years ahead. So I always think that it's really key for the future of English wine and the success of English wine that the larger producers and the higher profile producers are setting really high standards. And so I was really keen to see what Rathfinny are doing and delighted to see the reviews that they've already received for their wines. Now, this is their Blanc de Noir, and it's the 2015, which was their first vintage. I think the 2016 is also on the market now as well. But I'm really pleased that we've got this one, 2015, a small crop, but generally considered very high quality in the UK, possibly because of those lower yields, although we'll come back to lower yields in a minute. And on the website and on Nick's website, The Finest Bubble, reading what the drivers say about this, or the estate says about this wine, they were describing the aromas as, I think it was peony and strawberry, but certainly emphasizing this sort of floral character to it. And I was thinking, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's see. And then I opened it earlier and smelt it. And I just thought, hallelujah, that's exactly what it smells like. Just stunning. Fabulous aromas. Really perfumed. And it's fascinating to me because there is something floral to it. There's very much the wild strawberry character. There's also that hint of Turkish delight that I sometimes get on rosé champagnes as well. Actually, not just rosé champagnes, rosé wines, I think, can have this hint of Turkish delight, which I quite like. It's quite a heady sort of scent. But that is an astonishing perfume, absolutely beautiful. And it makes you, I have to say, if I close my eyes, I imagine I would be thinking rosé rather than white if I close my eyes. But it is a white, but you can see from the color, and actually, if one looks at the difference in color between the Blanc de Noir and the Charles Heidsieck rosé that comes next, you know, there's not a dramatic difference in terms of rosé hue. You could argue that the Blanc de Noir it seems to be halfway in my view between a white and a rosé. But certainly none the worse for that. But I think that that aroma is simply stunning. And we're going to talk a little bit, I want to introduce the discussion about the differences in style between English wine and champagne, although generalizations, of course, are always very dangerous. But I do think that one of the characteristics, I do think very often that English sparkling wines do have more exuberant aromas than champagne. I think champagne often is a bit more, you could say, more refined in a way, a bit more subtle, maybe more discreet. I think for me, one of the calling cards of English sparkling wine is the fact that actually the aromas and very often the flavors are a bit bolder than champagne. I know that's, as I say, it's a big generalization, but I think this particular wine bears this out. I can't think of any champagne that has aromas quite as bold as this, offhand, or not of this style anyway. They might do as they age, as they become more mature and more complex, then you might achieve that sort of boldness. But at this sort of age, wow, really quite something. And yet, at the same time, sometimes when you get that boldness, the aromas can come across as confected, particularly with, you know, in the still wine sector, you know, there are many aromas that are really strong, really bold, and they smell like a sweet shop. That's not the case here. This still retains a real delicacy of fragrance to it, rather than the confectionery shop.
There's something very distinctive about the fruit, Richard. You mentioned some of the terms that you found in the tasting notes. I think there's something else in there that we haven't got yet, but I can't quite put my finger on it. It's got in the palate, it's got a lovely bitter.
There is a bitterness to it, a really good bitterness.
Like a red.
I'll come back to that because I know that sounds a contradiction in terms.
But there's some really nice, like there is a real wild strawberry character to it. It's almost like dark cherry. I can't quite put my finger on it at the moment.
I'm not quite sure what it is at the moment as well, but there really is a tremendous intensity of flavour there. And yet again, I go back to this notion that it might be confected in a way. It really isn't. The finish is pristine. It's clean, it's bright, and it's amazingly long. And the palate has got this, just this fullness on the mid palate that is highly attractive, I think, a real joy. And the curiosity is, to me, that this again shows why it's so dangerous to generalize. This is only 4 grams per litre of residual sugar. Now, tasting this, I would have put this higher. But I think that shows a couple of things. One, maturity. As a wine ages, it might become a little bit rounder, and it may just taste naturally just a little bit sweeter as it tastes rounder. Secondly, the ripeness of the grapes. 2015 was relatively low yields, so the grapes that were left, I think, ripened quite successfully. And thirdly, there is another aspect to English wine, and this comes back to why I think English sparkling wines may sometimes, on the surface, have bolder flavours. There is a longer growing season. The actual budding in England often isn't so far removed from that in Champagne, maybe a week or so later, but not that far removed. But the harvest is often 2 or 3 weeks later. So the growing season is longer. Now, obviously that comes with challenges and threats, as many producers sadly found last year in 2019. But I do think that that extra length of the growing season, it just enables the grapes to build more flavour. And that combination of longer growing season and often lower yields, unfortunately, it is a fact of life in England that producers have to live with the fact that more often than not, their yields are going to be lower than they would like. It's very rare that you get a vintage like 2018 where you have a combination of good yields and good quality. Sadly, the reality is often lower yields than that. And lower yields, as we know, do give more intensity of flavour. And I think that's what's coming through here. Just wonderful. I'm really, really excited to taste this wine. The other aspect to it, which is really intriguing, the boldness of flavour, as I say, for me distinguishes it as English. Or, how can I put it? It distinguishes it to me as non-champagne. But I'm just trying to think, if I had this in a tasting of really good sparkling wines from maybe 1 or 2 other parts of the world, Oregon or Tasmania or somewhere like that, I wonder whether that sort of just ripeness of flavour that comes across here could also, you might find that elsewhere as well. I'm not quite sure.
One of the things, Richard, I wanted to mention, because one of the reasons I listed this sparkling wine was because I really like the texture of it.
Yep.
And the aromatics are, as you've just described, they're generous. But I love the texture because it is only 4 grams.
Yeah.
And often dosage as low as that means the acidity tends to come a bit forward. But
yes.
And so they've done something very well with the texture of this.
I do agree with you, and as the point is always made, that balance is about, it is about the balance between residual sugar and acidity, and I think they've, look, for a first release, this is pretty exceptional, and well done to the vineyard and the producers for achieving this balance in a first release. I was going to come back to bitterness. Because that's a really interesting point. And tasting it again, I'm finding that bitterness. I don't think you'd find that in a sparkling wine from Tasmania or Oregon. I think we're more likely to find that in England. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I remember having this discussion once with Richard Geoffroy from Dom Perignon. And I can't remember what vintage we were discussing, but it would have been around 2000, I think. And we were discussing one of the champagnes, and I said, there's just a slight bitter twinge on the end. And Richard threw his hands in the air and said, I love bitterness. And it was just a great moment. And I think if I'd said, there's a hint of salinity on the finish, he would have said, oh, I love salinity as well. But it was just a really, it was very funny. And there is something about bitterness. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We know that bitterness isn't a bad thing because we know that in food, we like bitterness as long as it's balanced by something else as well. And so, it's exactly the same in wine. I don't think bitterness is necessarily a bad word, but I do find a little bit of that on the finish here. I'd love to see this. Again, I'm enjoying it now. I'd love to see this with different food matches again, because I don't find the fizz intrusive in any way. I think it's beautifully integrated, and I'd really like to see how this works with food too. And that bit of a hint of bitterness could be really intriguing with food as well. That I think would make it a very good food match. And I said one of the things we were going to talk about is the difference between Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir. Well, we're certainly tasting 2 very different animals here. You could argue it's because we're tasting Champagne and English, but I think the difference is, I think there's as much a difference between the grapes, the grape mix, as there is between the origins. And I do really like the way the Blanc de Noir unashamedly expresses the extra dimension, the fruit, the aromatics, and the vinosity of the Pinot grapes. And just, I know some will be interested, the blend of the Blanc de Noir is 65% Pinot and 35% Meunier. And for those who don't know, Rathfinny is it's in Sussex. It's close to Alfriston, and it's only 3 miles from the sea. So a beautiful site, and it's an estate. So this is an estate wine, all made from their own grapes. So the vines, you know, if we're looking at the notion that older vines might give something even better, well, these are very young vines. So that bodes well for the future. The other aspect that is interesting about this, and I said I was going to concentrate on the contents, and this is more a marketing point, is that this is a Sussex PDO. So Sussex does have protected designation of origin for its sparkling wines. There is not total agreement in the English wine business as to whether this is the right direction. I don't really mind. I think if Rathfinny are proud of their estate and the county it comes from, and they've managed to achieve PDO status, good for them. And I think Camel Valley have achieved PDO status for one of their areas as well in Cornwall. I think, having said that, I can also quite understand why a lot of producers are less keen on it, because they source grapes from different counties. Nightimber, Chapel Down, various others, you know, they're sourcing grapes from different counties, so a county PDO is not so relevant for them at the moment. And I have to say, I have done tastings of both English sparkling wine and English still wine, where we have divided them by county to see whether we can see taste profile differences between the counties, and we haven't been able to. The differences between producer and style have been greater than the differences between origin. Now, that's not to say that that won't be true in 20 years' time. And I think in due course, it's quite likely that different distinctive tastes between counties will begin to emerge. And maybe Rathfinny, maybe what we're tasting here is a first step towards that in terms of understanding what's special about this part of Sussex.
Richard, I wonder whether, I don't think I've quite got the fruit yet, but I wonder whether it's a little bit like an apple and blackberry pie, because there's some red fruit in here. I can't quite still put my finger on it. I think there's a sort of blackberry, almost like rose hips kind of characteristic. But it's like a bit of like an apple and blackberry pie with a little bit of spice in it.
Could it be that you know that, okay, I know where you're coming from, but I'm wondering whether that bitterness isn't more reminiscent of something like damson.
Mm.
Now, I don't think the bitterness is nearly as strong as damson, but I think there is a hint of that. You know, that sort of, yes, for me, that's what it is actually.
I think that's what it is.
With plum and damson, the stone, the kernel,
yeah.
The bit of the fruit that's close to the kernel has that bit of bitterness to it. I think that's what I'm picking up here. So it could be as much a plum thing as a damson thing, but I think it is that sort of, that spectrum, as it were.
And one thing you said earlier about the later harvests in England, I think is fascinating, because I just looked down at my notes and it says the grapes were picked on the 19th of October.
Wow. and we know in Champagne these days, I mean, the pickings are often finished by mid-September now, isn't it? I mean, so, you know, there is a massive difference, and it shows, well, a potential advantage for England, but at what cost? You know, it's so difficult keeping the grapes and vines healthy that late in the season in our climate. Really tough.
But I've got to come back to this, the texture again.
Yeah.
I love something about that bitterness, the salinity. It tastes like it's about 10 grams of dosage.
Yes, I agree. It's got real mouthfeel to it, and yet at relatively low dosage. And I have to say, there's I can't think of any other English sparkling wine with a similar flavour profile to this that I've come across as yet. And don't get me wrong, I have huge admiration for an awful lot of English sparkling wines. And if I was scoring, there are a lot of English sparkling wines that I score very highly, and this would be amongst them. But from a flavour profile point of view, yeah, very unusual and different to anything I've tried before.
And I can't let you go before you go back and do a quick comparison.
With the
Blanc to Blanc.
Indeed.
And if you do get a chance to put this in a big glass, I think it really changes the Blanc de Blanc. I might pour this away and actually try the Raffini in it, because I think the red fruit might actually do very well in this big glass.
Yep. Well, is that meant to be a white Burgundy glass or a red Burgundy glass?
Yes. Good question.
Indeed. Okay, just a point here. Oh, thanks, Ian. My students used to distinguish between bitter-sweet and bitter-bitter. Now, Ian may well be talking about Chinese students there, as he lived in Hong Kong for many years. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Latter, bitter-bitter, the latter as in licorice. Okay, all right, I see that. I think I'd be more the bittersweet angle here, but that's an interesting point. Yeah, I think the other aspect of your Burgundy glass is that in that glass, I suspect, because you've got more of the wine in contact with the outside, it's going to warm up a little bit faster as well, and so you are going to have a bit more evolution in that glass as well. Right, on to Nick will tell us if he finds anything particularly revealing.
It's fascinating. I've done a few tastings with you, Richard. I have a thing about reduction. So this glass seems to be the reduction king.
Well,
for champagne, and again, it's bringing out a bit of the smoky character.
Okay, very interesting. I like reduction. One of the benefits of working with Dom Perignon for many years is I got used to the Dom Perignon note of reduction, which maybe I've got a bit of a cellar palate now, and I do really like it as a component, not as a dominant factor, but as a component. I think it's very smart. Yeah,
and that's really brought out the red fruit vibrancy. So smoky red fruit.
You're leading me down the garden path here, Nick. I'm going to have to try it in all sorts of glasses later. I can see it's going to be a long evening, but I don't mind that.
You can't experiment enough with glasses, in my mind. So I think you want to keep trying.
All right, good. Right, on to the Charles Heidsieck Brut Reserve Rosé. Again, I've been really looking forward to trying this. Charles Heidsieck is, if there is one non-vintage champagne that I could drink, that I had to drink all the time, this is the one I would choose, in its white form. And I do think that it has just been outstanding for the last, well, probably 10 years now. It's just been in stunning form as a non-vintage champagne. Partly, I think, because of the attitudes the house towards making champagne, and partly down to their incredibly adept use of reserve wines. And that's true in the rosé as well. And I tasted this rosé earlier, and it fulfilled all my expectations. I wanted it to be special, and I genuinely think it is. Although intriguingly, stylistically, I think it is quite different to the white Brut Reserve. So that intrigued me, that interested me. But Charles Heidsieck, and I think I'm saying that those are my views. Many in the wine trade would echo those views as well. Charles Heidsieck, there is no major champagne house more respected than Charles Heidsieck at the moment. And their awards in all the wine competitions are testament to that as well, that the wines show as well in blind tastings as they do when we're just drinking and enjoying. So this rosé is, sorry, I'm just going back to my notes here. So for those interested in the makeup of this, equal proportions of the three champagne grapes, and they make up 80% of the blend. And I suspect one of the keys here, and Nick may want to say more about this in a minute, is that the base for this is the 2012 vintage. Stunning vintage in Champagne, in fact, well, better than stunning probably. And so that really helps that we've got a 2012 base. And what that means is that 20% of this is reserve wines, 50-50 Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And of that, 5%, and of the wine generally, 5% is red wine. So it is a blend of red and white. And the red wine is not more than 5 years old. But some of the reserve wines, the white reserve wines, may be more than 5 years old. And they blend in the red for colour, and they believe that the red will give aromatics as well. While you're tasting this, and while Nick's tasting it as well, just a quick word about Rosé Champagne. Generally, it's one of my favourite stories in Champagne. That when they first started making Champagne in whenever it was, the late 17th, early 18th centuries, the idea that the market was for white Champagne, but most of Champagne was planted with red grapes because they'd grown red grapes to produce red wine to celebrate Mass. And yet the market and the court, Louis XIV's court, they wanted white Champagne. And so if you made the secret was to, as Dom Perignon partly discovered, was to move the press houses closer to the vineyards so you could press the black grapes as quickly as possible, reducing the likelihood of any colour leaching from the skins into the juice. And if you made a rosé Champagne, it was considered a mistake. And for the next 200 years, 250 years, rosé Champagne, one word to describe rosé Champagne in France was taché, which literally means soiled or spoilt. It wasn't meant to look like that. It was a sign for many, it was a sign of poor workmanship if it was actually rosé. A proper Champagne was white. And until recently, many Champagne houses didn't produce a rosé. I'm not sure when Paul Roger produced their first rosé, but it wasn't too long ago. My own view is that we have a great deal to thank Laurent Perrier for. Laurent Perrier, with their Cuvée Rose, really put Rosé Champagne on the map, and they did the Rosé Champagne many favors, because they put it in a beautiful bottle, and they charged a higher price than for white. Is Rosé Champagne more expensive to make than for white? No, in most cases. But they charged a premium, and Champagne still does. Rosé Champagne commands a premium. They've got a lot to be grateful to Laurent Perrier for. For me, they reinvented Rosé Champagne. Even though some other houses had been making it, like Dom Perignon, none of them had put it on the map like Laurent Perrier managed to do. And since then, of course, Rosé Champagne has become very fashionable and is now an important part of the rosé market, and in certain markets, a very, very important part of the Champagne market. I'm just looking at one or two comments here. Isn't Charles Heidsieck's access to so many aged reserve wines because it was neglected under the previous owners and an embarrassment of riches in the reserve library? Yes, I am sure that is true. But there is a point here. Old wine isn't necessarily good wine. We've all come across wines that we've kept too long in our cellar or elsewhere, and old wine isn't necessarily good. It still takes a really good blender, a really good chef de cave to turn those older wines to their advantage. And Heidsieck have done a wonderful job of that. And also, most of those oldest reserve wines now from the previous owners would have been used. Yes. The fact is, they're still making outstanding Champagne. So it has become, if it has become part of the house style, I see that as a pretty skillful use of your resources and knowing how to manage what you've got. And there must have been some pretty smart people in the strategy meetings at that time to decide how to use them and how to actually use them to the advantage of the Charles Heidsieck brand, which I really think they have. So onto this, the Charles Heidsieck Rosé. Now this, immediately the colour is different to many rosé champagnes on the market. Often, you know, there is a pink hue to the colour. Sometimes there's orange. This is more the eau de perdrix, the onion skin end of the spectrum for rosé champagne. And I don't like using the term onion skin because I always think it's, well, I certainly wouldn't use it on my own back label because I think some would find it off-putting. We certainly don't want a wine that smells of onions. But at the same time, it is a character of certain rosé champagnes. I have noticed that with this, of all these three, in fact, maybe it's just the glass I've got, but the mousse is particularly persistent. The bead is particularly persistent in the rosé. And these aromas they're just complex. I find there's loads going on here. If there's a fruit character, it's not the primary fruit character. This is the first one where the fruit is more a cooked fruit character, cooked strawberry or something like that, or maybe candied fruit, which is one of the other characteristics that come through as champagne ages. But there's also something much more savoury. There's something slightly woody, although as far as I know, the reserve wines aren't aged in oak at Charles Heidsieck. They are? They're not, no. But I think that there is this almost slightly cedary character that comes through. I find a note of aniseed. Sorry?
So that's the reduction. So the one thing with Charles Heidsieck is a lot of people think it has oak aging. And it's the way they, I guess, like Dom Perignon, they do everything they can to protect the winemaking process from oxidation. So one of the side effects of that is you get what we call this smoky charm sort of to it, which is very easy to confuse with wood. And you know, some wines, like some people even think Dom Perignon has oak aging because that reductive personality that it has confuses us all. So now,
okay.
Just while I have a moment, let me talk about 2012 because this is from the 2012 vintage, which was a nightmare in Champagne, and right until the last 2 to 3 weeks, and then the sun came out and helped because otherwise they were thinking this was going to be like 1984, which was one of those years where you never find good champagne from 1984. But right to the last minute, the sun came out, and a bit like I'm suffering from today, the sunshine really made the vintage. And 2012 I will put out there as one of those vintages in Champagne you want to watch, because I've written recently that some of the 12s are as good as the 2008s. Everybody got very excited about 8. I would suggest you're just as excited about the 12s because they have this beautiful purity, considering they had a very tough year and quite a lot of rain when they didn't want it. So they had a small crop because of all of the problems. But once the sun came out, that small crop ripened with incredible intensity. And perhaps that's some of what we're smelling now.
Well, indeed, that there is just normally, I mean, I've often said in the past that with Champagne, when we're assessing still wines, we see length of flavour as very much a quality cue, which it is, generally speaking. With Champagne, particularly young Champagne, I don't expect a lot of length of flavour. It doesn't particularly bother me. I can get so much pleasure out of the aromatics and that middle palate, that dancing of the fizz and everything, that I don't need a long finish for it to be high quality. But here we've got a Champagne with an astonishing length, I think. And it really is interesting. The fruit profile, I'm trying to work out what this reminds me of. I mean, there is this cooked fruit character, and I don't find it candied fruit. For me, it is more cooked. It's more savoury in style. And there's also and sort of slight aniseed character to it for me. And then one of the characteristics, I think, is that, you know, if you're eating a tarte tatin or something like that, if some of the apple is slightly burnt, it's like caramelized apple. There's some of that sort of character that comes through, which is quite highly flavored. And again, you know, that's one of those characteristics that reminds you a little bit of oak, because it's almost a slight toastiness of the fruit. But for me, that's there as well, which is, it's really complex. And it's so interesting because it's chalk and cheese with much rosé champagne. If you compared this, I would suggest, with the Laurent Perrier Cuvée Rose, for instance, as an obvious example, which is much more primary red fruits, I think. Beautiful champagne, but just a very different style. This is really interesting rosé. And I said that I find this different in style to the white. I really do. The white Charles Heidsieck, I adore it for the fact that it manages to marry youthfulness, primary characters, a bit of reduction, and that complexity from the reserve wines as well. And so I find that the Charles Heidsieck Brut Reserve White, it combines primary, secondary, and tertiary characters all in the same champagne, and yet somehow it is totally harmonious. This, for me, it's all tertiary. And so it's a really different, really interesting to see how their white and rosé in the reserve non-vintage end are so different in style. Good for them. I love it. It's very bold.
I think one of the things that's making quite a big difference as well, I spend a lot of my time in talking about champagne and lees, understanding lees aging. So the two champagne, the sparkling wine from Raffini, I think, had 3 years of lees aging. The Gimone also had 3 years. Now this has doubled, so this is into 6 years. And I'm the longer I spend in champagne, focusing in it, the longer I'm trying to help people understand about texture, which is what I've mentioned earlier. And I think that's where the lees aging really shows. So this has that, I call it a real rounding effect. So I come back to the how I measure all these things, and on my tongue I get this sort of just joyful sort of rounding effect from and that's the lees aging. So the longer the champagne is in contact with the yeast and then the dead yeast, I think the more it alters the texture. So the houses in Champagne, you know, here's a really good example from vintages where the acidity is a little bit high, so low, you know, quite low pH. Then they have to extend the lees aging, because that's the only thing that offsets the overexcited acidity.
Yep.
Long lees aging seems to do magic things to softening our perception of acidity, because acidity can be spiky.
Yes.
But leave it in contact with lees for many more years than you perhaps would normally, and it seems to have this rounding kind of effect. And so this is base 12, and I think that's what we're tasting, is textural management. You know,
I mentioned that I find that this has got a savoury character to it, and lees aging is associated with the sort of those savoury yeasty characteristics. How do you use any other words to describe savoury in this sort of champagne?
Well, is sometimes I think savoury is, I'm getting bitter again, you see. So
I'm getting bitter as well. I picked up bitterness on this too.
And I think that's often with a lot of Charles Heidsieck, that's one of the attractive qualities. So we talk about reduction perhaps too much, but that just means the way it's been made results in a bit of that smoky character. This savouriness, you know, you've got a bit of bitter. Some of the fruit in this, you know, it's got ripeness, but there's also a bitterness, and it's that combination I quite like. Ripe fruit, slightly bitter fruit, and when you bring them together, it's beautiful.
Okay. I couldn't agree more. I suppose the only other thing I would say about this, I feel that I'm drinking this now, and I'm enjoying it so much now. I would drink it now. If I had 6 bottles of this, I suspect they'd all be gone by the end of the year. I'm not saying it won't keep if it's already 80 years old and it's tasting as good as this. It's obviously it's going to last for another 2 or 3 years, but I have to say I'm enjoying it so much now. I would drink this. Whereas the previous 2, I'd happily keep. Well, certainly the Blanc de Blanc, I would be happy to hold on to for a bit. And I think the Blanc de Noir, I'm really tempted to buy 1 or 2 bottles of that and see how, particularly as it's a first vintage, and just see how that, and just forget about them and see how it is in a few years' time. I'm always intrigued by that.
Well, you almost fed me a perfect question, Richard, because about a week ago, I was lucky enough to do a tasting with Charles Heidsieck Blanc, so the sort of white version.
Yes.
And we did it with Cyril, who's the Cyril Brunn, the chef de cave at Charles Heidsieck. And we went right back to the base. We did all the bases. So we did non-vintage vertical. And it's, as you know, I love doing things that are a little bit different. And we tasted back to 1993. And they're non-vintages, remember. They're from a dominant year. So some of the houses have these non-vintages because they make them, remember, every spring. They blend them from the previous harvest. And it's wonderful to be able to do a non-vintage vertical.
Wow.
And so some of those older ones show the really big differences with the amount of reserve wines that they put in them. And the reserve wine, we could have another whole tasting on.
Wow.
Because, this has 6% red wine. It has 20% reserve wines. So not that much. Some of the whites have over 50% reserve wines. And that's not always because it's a bad year. It might often be because it's such a good year. They need to moderate the vintage characteristic. So, blending's that marvelous thing. It's not always done because it's a bad year or a less good year. It's often done as much because the year's too strong.
Yes.
So.
Good, thank you. That is a tasting I would like to have done. Never mind, can't do them all. Ian has asked, is it possible that your reference to food pairing is because this Lee's character is in effect like an umami savoury? Yes, I believe so. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, don't get me wrong, I think fruity champagnes can pair with food as well. But when you get a champagne like this that already has that bit of savoury character at the end, yes, I think that's very attractive. So a good food match. Now what we're going to do now is we have more or less, sadly, that is the end of the 3 champagnes. Well, it's not the end of the bottles, I hope. If anyone's finished all 3 of them by now, well done. But we are going to do a quick poll. Cecilia, you are going to it would just be interesting to know if you have a favourite between these sparkling wines this evening. So I'm always intrigued to see what people like most.
Okay, we are ready here with the poll.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Oh, let me put my glasses on.
Our host and panelists can't vote. Sorry.
No.
We're not allowed to. Okay. And I know you'd have voted for all 3 anyway. So while you're voting for those, I hope if there are any other questions, please ask them now because time is up. And I do realise that some people have other things to do on a Saturday afternoon. And I suspect that actually some of you have just been watching this as an aperitif before Christian Seeley presenting Chateau Pichon Baron in an hour or so. Just one question here. What is the technical benefit of opening a bottle of champagne sparkling wine an hour before drinking? Well, I'll answer that, but I'll be interested to know what Nick says as well. I'm not sure that I don't practice that. Okay, I tend to drink it as soon as it's opened. I don't normally open a sparkling wine before drinking. And to be fair, I don't open a still wine an hour before drinking. If I feel it needs decanting, I decant it. I feel, and most reds, I have to say, when I'm drinking red wine at home, I do decant most of them. Well, I just pour them into a jug or a carafe. I just find red wine tastes better from a carafe. So I'm not convinced that opening an hour in advance helps for either still or sparkling. Nick?
I'm not going to agree with you there, Richard, because sparkling wine will, when you first open it, it's a little bit shocked. So the first few minutes, you actually don't really want to taste it. You know, the aromatics, it'll all go up your nose and not be very nice. My advice is open it 1 hour before you're going to drink it, and you're going to enjoy it a whole lot more if you've given it a bit of time. And actually, we've been running these series of Instagram online tastings for the last 12 weeks during lockdown. And the one thing we always did, so like tonight, Richard, I would have had an opening ceremony. So we would have opened the champagnes or sparkling wines 1 hour before we did the main tasting. And the aromatics do this. So, and when the aromatics do that, it massively alters our enjoyment factor. So don't worry about bubbles. People panic when they see me pour it in a large glass. I don't drink champagne for the bubbles. I drink it for the texture and aromatic enjoyment. The bubbles are there as a little sort of part on the side. So never be afraid to open the champagnes. And I've also proven on this very point that if you have half a bottle or so, don't be afraid to close it, and it'll keep for a week. And not really show any oxidation. So don't be afraid of champagne. Open it early, and if you don't drink it all,
I'll certainly try that. That makes it's perfectly logical to me. And if you're well enough organised to do that, then good. And Nick has just touched on a very important point to finish off with. If you don't manage to finish these 3 bottles this evening, then obviously, you know, there are various champagne stoppers that you can, hopefully you've got champagne stoppers which you can put in them. And as Nick says, the key, put the stopper in and keep it in the fridge. The key to keeping any wine fresh, red, white, rosé, orange, whatever, stick it in the fridge. How do we keep food fresh? We refrigerate it. Wine's no different.
Richard, I don't know whether you're going to agree with me on this, but champagne and sparkling wines give off carbon dioxide, which is a natural preservative. So if you close this now, mine's, you know, I've barely drunk a quarter of it.
Yeah.
If I close this now, because the carbon dioxide is given off, it'll help protect it. And that's why I say...
That's a very good point. That is I hadn't thought of that in that way, but that is a really good point. And we know that because when we open it again, there's a whoosh as the carbon dioxide explodes.
And
very good.
So for up to, because it's only, I've only drunk that much, I've been very good, then it'll probably keep, I would open this in 7 days' time. Unfortunately, this is my house, so...
It's not going to, we both know. Exactly. Excellent. Well, look, on that note, I hope you've enjoyed this afternoon. Lovely to be. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to open 3 lovely bottles of sparkling wine this time on a Saturday afternoon. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the bottles as well, whether it's this evening or in the days ahead. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you all at a future 67 Pall Mall event. Okay.
Richard,
yes, Cecilia.
Say goodbye.
Oh yes, sorry.
Yeah, the results.
We did the poll. Yes.
Yep. 3, 2, 1. There it is.
Oh gosh, and England takes it. Would you believe it? Champagne Charlie will be, he'll be crying his eyes out. Or Charlie well. England takes it 45%. Well done, Rath Finney.
The Rathfini Blanc de Noir tastes really good.
Against some very good competition. So, well done. Thank you very much for that. That is excellent. Okay, I'm really pleased. Good stuff. And happy English Wine Week. Okay.
Richard, one thing before you go.
Yes.
I can't do a tasting with you online without reminding you. I started my company 6.5 years ago. You did my very first tasting for us. So, and I don't think I've done another tasting with you since then. So
you've invited me to lots of tastings now.
So thank you for doing that, and everybody else enjoy your Saturday.
Cheers. Thanks, Nick. Cheers, everyone.